Hello, I'm Triciahorne. I'm standing in front of portraits painted by my mother-in-law of my husband and me at the time we were married. She was Nesta Bowen Horne, one of Canada's finest portrait painters in her day. My husband John and I are both past presidents of the Canadian Club, so it was a family affair, and we both thoroughly enjoyed the work. I'm going to present vignettes of occasions that happened during my almost 50 years with Canadian Club. And to follow, I hope that you will be interested in what I have to tell you. Canada, and yes, the entire world, is caught up in the coils of a communication revolution. Just as we catch on to the workings of the latest device, along comes a bigger, a better, a new and improved version. I regularly use FaceTime with a son in Toronto and another in London, England, and cousins in Australia and Sweden. What has this to do with Canadian Club, you ask? Canadian Club came into being as a means of communication way back in 1893, Hamilton, Ontario. 5 young men born in Canada did not have the connection with the old country organizations of their parents. They formed the Canadian Club. As they matured and left Hamilton for Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and other centers, other Canadian clubs were formed. The Canadian Club of Victoria was formed in 1906. The Women's Canadian Club of Victoria was created in 1908, the third of the women's clubs to set up. The movement was now in place from Halifax to Victoria, just 15 years since its inception. The main purpose of the clubs was to expose its members to information to foster throughout Canada an interest in all matters of public concern. Speakers from far and near presented their points of view to the members, sharing information, spreading ideas, communicating. By 1908, there was a loose federation of all the clubs. For a per capita fee, the office in Ottawa provided each club with an offer of 5 speakers. All, some, or none could be accepted. In 1939, the Association of Canadian Clubs was formalized by an Act of Parliament. This was the state of things when I joined and became a member of the Women's Canadian Club of Victoria in 1970. The men's club had 200 plus members, while our club had over 500. I wanted to widen my horizons beyond children and recipes. It turned out to be a perfect fit, and here I am still. In those days, both the Victoria Times and the Daily Colonist newspapers covered club news with photos and text. Everyone had heard about Canadian clubs. After the required 2 years membership in my club, I was elected onto the board as a member at large. In turn, I became secretary, second vice president, first vice president, then president, 1980 to 1982, 11 years in all. The association held meetings each spring and fall in alternating cities, eastern and western. Usually the president attended, but her husband became very ill, and I, as her veep, went to London, Ontario in her place. It was a baptism of fire. At the session, just before Saturday's meal, the executive director announced that he would be retiring at the end of these meetings. he had neglected to inform his national secretary. Beforehand, she was struck dumb. She didn't turn up for lunch, but about an hour into the afternoon session, she appeared, cheeks as red as her hair, very angry and very drunk. It took 3 people to calm her down and remove her from the room. Sometime later, we heard she'd gone directly back to Ottawa and trashed the office. Like, wow. Meanwhile, back to September 1974, Victoria. I was secretary to a sweet older lady who was inclined to be overwhelmed. I just slipped into mother mode, and we two had a wonderful work arrangement. I was so sure I had been discreet with my help, but at the end of our 2-year terms, the other board members mentioned it to me with gratitude. I had made her look good, and that was just what I wanted to do. In September 76, I became second vice president and social convener. Our meetings were held at 2 p.m. in the Newcomb Auditorium. We had a doorwoman at each of the 2 entrances from the lobby to the auditorium, where each member showed her card and was counted on the tally. Only house guests were permitted as visitors. This stipulation caused a hiccup when our speaker, Lynn Hancock, writer of delightful animal books, was our speaker. She wrote, "A seal is in my sleeping bag," and "The ape came out of my hat box," among other titles. As well, she just happened to be my daughter Megan's teacher at Monterey Elementary School, where several animals lived in the classroom. The favorite was the gibbon. The children lined up to take it home for the weekend. That was a special treat. I asked if Megan could come to the meeting. The president was a stickler for the rules. "Only house guests can be visitors," she said. I replied, "But she and I live in the same house." The other board members came to my help when they said, "It isn't as if a 10-year-old will want to come to any more of our meetings." And she did come, and she loved it, and it was fascinating for her to see her teacher in another guise. Where we have head tables now, at the Newcomb, these people were seated on the stage at a banquet table covered by the most beautiful white with blue embroidery linen tablecloth. One of my duties was this tablecloth. Well, one meeting, after having had the cloth laundered and put in a different place, I forgot to bring it to the meeting. There was lots of time. I was parked in one of the only five parking spots behind the auditorium. A quick dash home to collect the cloth, back downtown and into the very same parking spot I had left 20 minutes before. Now that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore. Also on the stage were the lectern and 3 flags, a Canadian, a British Columbia, and our own Canadian club, in a triple stand. After the speaker, I would leave the meeting quietly, pop over to the Empress Hotel to be sure that our tea things were set up at the south fireplace in the lobby. The board, speakers, and special guests would arrive soon for the tea and toasted raisin bread that I had ordered the day before. Tea and toast cost 90 cents each. I had a cache of dimes for making change. My most important duty was the annual Christmas tea held in the Crystal Ballroom of the Empress Hotel. A joyful occasion. and the joint luncheons we shared from time to time with the men's club. For these, I always wrote a letter to the catering manager, keeping a copy for myself. This stood me in good stead sometime later. It was another joint luncheon. Everything had been ordered and arranged, but even so, I was down at the Crystal Ballroom by 10 a.m. in time for our noon meal. To my horror, it was set for only 250 places. I brought out my copy of the letter where I distinctly said 350 places. The catering manager, he mumbled, and then he fumbled, but he was still quite intransigent. I had read somewhere that when dealing in a trying situation, he was well over 6 feet, I was just over 5 feet and had a ghastly cold, to step into your adversary's space. It worked. He took a step back, and then he backed down. In no time at all, 100 more places were being set up in the Palm Court, while the kitchen whipped up 100 more meals. Not all the desserts were the same, and there were several complaints about that, but if they had only known. The hotel sent me a weekly printout of events. The first one that December gave me a nasty surprise. Another women's club had booked to hold their Christmas luncheon at noon on the same day as our Christmas tea was being held at 2 p.m. That's not the sort of service a group which held its annual Christmas tea every year since 1909 expects. I made an appointment with the same catering manager, my iron hand in a velvet glove, and a plan. The Palm Court would serve as a waiting area for our club members, while the other club members would exit through the doors into the conservatory. Since we usually decorated the tables ourselves, this time the hotel would have to do it. We wanted the head table done, and we wanted small seasonal flower arrangements on each table. And instead of white napkins, we wanted green and red ones. As there would be so little time between events, I wanted it done before the lunch. After all, they were being inconvenienced as well. This was being carefully written down on an order form. The only thing he said to me was, "I will be sure that everything is done as you have requested, Mrs. Horne." And it was. Not all the suggested joint meetings came about. From time to time, the current presidents did not get along, or cooperate, or even communicate with one another. Sometimes, even the club members were snarky with the other club members. Sometimes it was ridiculous. Back before my time, in 1968 or 69, the clubs were offered Prince Philip. The women accepted, but the men did not. Our membership ballooned to over 1,000, even though there were only 500 places in the ballroom. But we had 500 very happy members. During her term, our presidents entertained the past presidents at lunch after the executive meetings in September, December, and June. On completion of her term, she was given life membership. Honorary memberships, which did not include a vote, were given to the current chatelaine of Government House, the Premier's wife, the Mayor's wife. Consequently, our past presidents remained in the club. Over and over again, the men asked, "How do you keep your past presidents?" "We give them life memberships." "No way," they replied. "Heaven forfend." Well, in September 1978, I became first vice president. My duty was to provide speakers for our meetings, and that included the 5 national ones, and to stand by the president. Hence my trip in the spring of 1980 to London, Ontario. I also met the speakers at the airport or the ferry terminal, provided accommodation if required, and took him or her to lunch before our 2 p.m. meeting. The national speakers usually did tours of 4 or 5 clubs in a certain area. One day, we noticed that our national speakers arrived on a Monday or a Friday. It turned out they all wanted to have a weekend in Victoria. Many, of course, had their own plans, but others we were very happy to see that they had a pleasant time here. In 1994, President Maureen Bennett and her husband took the speaker out on their own sailboat for the day. I don't have any programs prior to 1979. In that year, a joint luncheon held in the old original dining room of the Empress was to hear Governor General Edward R. Schreyer, and the tickets cost $9.95. It was a sellout of 500. In those days, ladies all wore hats and gloves to lunches and teas. But Mrs. Schreyer never wore a hat. So all the ladies went to have their hair done that morning. While sitting under the dryer and reading the paper, they saw a photograph of Mrs. Schreyer arriving in Victoria wearing a hat. There was to be a reception in the royal suite prior to the luncheon. We managed to contact the board members and ask them to bring a hat just in case. We contacted one of the hotel welcoming parties and asked her to call us the moment the vice-regal party arrived. To be hats or not to be hats? We eagerly awaited the phone to ring, and when it did, she says, "Put your hats on." We all agreed that Mrs. Schreyer had discovered how convenient hats were when your hair was having a bad day. Membership dues for 1980-81 and 81-82, my term as president, were $8. We were still at the Newcomb with tea at the Empress after, but there were changes in the air. Our arrangement with the management at Newcomb often were prickly, and at times we felt unreasonable, but we needed space. Things peaked when we were informed they would no longer store our flags and stand. One lady's husband was very handy. He cut the poles in half, added ferrules so that they could be rejoined. Elizabeth Campbell made a bag to hold the poles and flags. While portable, it was very heavy. Shortly after, I polled the past presidents about us purchasing a lightweight flag set and stand, and they all agreed it was a good idea. A few hours later, one of them phoned me back and said, "Tricia, those flags don't belong to us. They were presented to the Newcomb Auditorium at its official opening by a well-known philanthropist." We informed the Newcomb. They checked their records, and sure enough. As well, the hotel was often moving our tea locale from place to place. We lived with it. Women are so adaptable and adept at accommodating. On the other hand, the season was going well, with excellent speakers, both local and national. Tickets for our 72nd annual Christmas tea were $6.25. Entertainment was provided by the choir from Lester B. Pearson College of the Pacific. And while I and the men's club president were congenial, there were no joint meetings. I had attended the 1980 meeting in London, Ontario, where an executive meeting had been planned for November in Vancouver, amidst many complaints about the rain in Vancouver. Well, we were all being bussed to the Toronto airport to get our planes home when the heavens opened. The traffic all stopped. It was raining so hard. Come November in Vancouver, it was having one of those glorious, sunny autumn spells. The air so clean and soft on your skin. The mountains looked as if they were close enough to touch. In July of 1981, I attended the association's biennial conference in Ottawa, wearing two hats, one as the president of my club and one as a national officer. I had been elected regional director for BC, representing our 9 clubs. This time I knew people before it all began, which was nice. At the first session, I sat next to a chap from Hamilton. We chatted as we sorted out what papers we would need soonest, and I came across a list of the delegates. The second name on the list was Nesta Bass of Hamilton Women. I asked Bill if he knew her. He did. I said, I absolutely, positively have to meet her. And he looked at me obliquely until I explained. Both my mother-in-law and my daughter are named Nesta. At coffee break, I met her. At these gatherings, there are always pleasant pastimes occurring in the evenings. I chose a cruise on the Rideau Canal, as did several ladies from Hamilton. We were cruising along most pleasantly when, whoomph, we were shipwrecked. The operator waded ashore, tied us up to the stone wall, and told us to stay with the vessel. We spent the next 90 minutes getting to know and like each other. The operator returned with help. We were returned to base and compensated for our inconvenience. We all agreed that while it was not a usual experience, it certainly was fun. Several years later, the Bass family moved to Victoria, and Nesta joined our club and was on the board. We didn't have a set day for our meetings. That's how we could give the national speaker a weekend in Victoria. When we moved to the 3rd Tuesday of the month, she could no longer attend. She and I are having lunch together tomorrow. Another night, we were taken to a lodge in the Laurentians for a wonderful dinner. On the way back to the hotel, the bus slipped in a muddy section of the unpaved road, and we had to be rescued again. The first speaker of my 1981-82 season was Premier Richard Hatfield of New Brunswick, at a joint meeting with the men's club. During the meal, Hatfield was telling me about Charles and Diana's wedding, which he attended. A news photo was taken of us. At that particular moment, we happened to be discussing the mirrored ball that hung from the ceiling of the ballroom. But that photo appeared in newspapers from coast to coast the next day. My relatives in the Maritimes sent me clippings. And in spite of our not having any joint meetings, the men's president invited me to a private lunch to advise me that their club was accepting women as members. I returned to my members and asked them, do we act or react? We only have to make one change in the bylaw. We have to change any woman to any person. It passed unanimously. My husband John, Peter Campbell, and Dr. Farquhar of UVic became the first 3 male members of our club. The final speaker of my term was Dr. Lois Wilson, the first woman moderator of the United Church of Canada. A reporter and a photographer came to our meeting. Photos were taken. She was interviewed, but nothing appeared in the newspaper the next day. Was this the beginning of the end of publicity for us? Our club also put on fashion shows, took excursions, were invited to Government House on occasion. A new national director had been hired in 1981. He insisted on a clause where after a year, either party could cancel. Also, he hired a national secretary and a stenographer, Barbara Crowder. He put the clause in for his own benefit, but we were so glad to be able to use it at the end of the year. The secretary agreed to take on the job for 1 year only. In 1983, Barbara Crowder took over and was with us for 22 years. Elizabeth Campbell was president when we celebrated our 75th anniversary in 1984 with a dinner and entertainment in the Crystal Ballroom. Our honorary national president, Brigadier General Henry Bell Irving, was there, as was our national president, Major General Richard Romer, National Director Barbara Crowder. I was Regional Director for BC, Alan Pierce, past National President, and several past presidents from the Men's Club. Was somebody in that club learning things? A huge break with tradition came about in 1988. Our annual Christmas tea, for the first time ever, was not at the Crystal Ballroom because the hotel was deep in a reno dubbed Operation Teacup. The Harbour Towers Hotel did a commendable job in its stead. We were glad to be back in the refurbished Crystal Ballroom at the Empress for December 1989. Our club left the Newcomb Auditorium after our AGM in June 1989, moving to the Princess Mary restaurant for noontime lunches beginning that October. They were most accommodating, allowing us the freedom of whatever day we had a speaker. One of our members was able to get fresh Arctic char from time to time, and their chef was only too glad to cook it perfectly for us. The 2 clubs were joint hosts of the 1991 National Executive Meeting. About time, as it had been 20 years since we'd last hosted one of these. Besides the meeting, which proceeded smoothly, we laid on a tour of the Parliament buildings, a city tour, and a reception in the ballroom of Government House on a glorious, warm, sunny October evening. French doors were open to the balcony, allowing a fabulous view of the newly snow-dusted Olympic Mountains. Across the sparkling Strait of Juan de Fuca, it was perfect. Their honors had not been there to greet us, but they arrived about an hour later, having chartered a plane from California because all the large planes were fogged in and couldn't take off. Everyone was impressed, but that's how Dorothy and David Lamb operated. They were wonderful. 1993 was the National Centennial, and naturally held in Hamilton. It was a whirlwind of celebrations, which I really don't remember much. How could I? Up on cloud 9, with delight and amazement, I'd reached the top. My honorary president was the Honorable Lincoln Alexander. We had 4 incredible years working together. Back in Victoria in 1995, a momentous occasion occurred. The Men's Canadian Club of Victoria and the Women's Canadian Club of Victoria segued into the Canadian Club of Victoria. Luncheon meetings continued at the Princess Mary, but we of the Women's Club retained the Christmas tea. In January of 1998, Maureen Bennett and I were invited to an ad hoc meeting in Vancouver to help plan the association's fall annual meeting. Before ferry reservations were available, our vehicle was the first car not to get on to the 9 o'clock ferry. So, no sense going at all. We turned around, Maureen drove me home. We rang Vancouver with our tale of woe, only to be handed a bombshell. Vancouver was not able to host the meeting. Over a cup of tea, panacea for all ills, John and we, who had worked at the 1991 meeting, said, we could do it again. Exuberantly, we called Barbara into Ottawa with the news. It made her day, as she had only just hung up from Vancouver's sad news. In our earnestness and zeal, we had committed a faux pas enorme. We had committed the club without even mentioning it to President Lloyd Newsham. He found out several days later when he received a letter from Barbara. We 3 took him to lunch and each extended an apology, which he accepted magnanimously. Another problem. Where do we hold it? This is a conference town, and we wanted space with only 8 months lead time. Fortunately, John had lunch every Friday with a group of men, which included the general manager of the Victoria Conference Centre. At 100 delegates, we were considered a small group, which was in our favor, as long as we didn't mind being moved around. Well, we'd had experience at that. It could be done, and it was. The Empress Hotel could handle us. John and I, as co-conveners, were given the most gorgeous suite overlooking the inner harbor at conference rates. It was just perfect for entertaining. We Victorians thought it would be a good spot to view the Symphony Splash in August, so we booked it. When conference was over, we quite casually asked how much it would cost. $1,000. How much would just the day rate be? $800. We canceled, and each of us made a generous donation to the Symphony Splash. One of the conference dinners was held in the reading room of the Union Club. Entertainment was provided by the Pearson College of the Pacific Choir. Their leader was wearing an intriguing bolero-type jacket with an exquisite design on the back. His wife had made it for him because, as she said, all the audience ever sees of you is your back. It was a neat idea. But the neatest was, just before thanking the choir, John introduced Mary MacDonald to them. She had been Lester B. Pearson's personal secretary during his entire political life. They swarmed around her, a real live connection to the man for whom their school was named. She graciously went into the library with them while they had their refreshments and asked her questions. And now, In September 2020, I will have belonged to the Canadian Club for 50 years. There, I have shared with you some of the most important experiences I've had during the club, but I must admit that the three most important were when I was president of the Women's Canadian Club of Victoria from 1980 to 1982, national president of the Association of Canadian Clubs from 1993 to 1997, and then most especial of all, I was president of our own club when we were celebrating our own centenary in 2006 to 2008.